They're called man's best friends. We look at this passage in the Gospels. Man's best friends. They show up in our favorite stories, our favorite TV shows, our favorite movies, our favorite books. Dogs are part of Americana. Even here in the Valley, dogs are part of childhood lore. Many of us grew up with a favorite dog, a companion, a comfort, a sidekick. We had dogs at every activity imaginable when we were kids. In fact, I had two of them growing up, two childhood companions, two Irish setters, especially Abby. Abby was there for everything: birthdays, Christmases, baseball games, hide and seek deep into the night. Many of you have the same kinds of memories of dogs, if you're a dog person. Some of you may be cat people. Dogs, though, become part of the family because they're the companion types. When it's time for them to go, we feel as though we have lost a member of the family. That's the American dog. American dogs, though, that's not the norm for most of human history. Dogs have served as companions for hunting. Many of you use them for hunting. They've also served in service for others, but it's really an American thing over the past 100 years for dogs to come under our roofs and live as pets. Some of them even spending the night in our bedrooms. That's an American thing. That's not the norm. And that's certainly true as we come to what we find in the Scriptures regarding dogs. Dogs are typical. In the Scriptures, they're typical of the way it is and has been for the past few thousand years. They're not Americana. They're anything but a slice of the American dream. The dog, especially in Jesus' day, even as we find it in our text this morning here in Mark chapter 7, they're at the low end of the food chain. They are ruthless. They roam in packs. They're scavengers. They probably carry disease. They're mangy. And if you were a good Jew, you did not find yourself in the company of a dog. They were despicable. They were considered unclean. And they were despicable because they were around trash and garbage and dead bodies. And they may have been there for the protection of the community, but they are mangy. They are not an American dog. These dogs that we find in the Scriptures will not be in the Christmas card this holiday season. They are much less than human. And so they show up in our gospel text this morning. And as we come to our passage this morning, we see that Jesus himself is traveling. Jesus is traveling in an area outside of Israel proper, and he's actually traveling through a region that has dogs in its past, dogs in its history. Now, Jesus is looking for some privacy. We see that in the text as well. And ministry for Jesus, come Mark chapter 7, as we walk with Jesus through the Gospel of Mark, starting with chapter 1, all the way up here to chapter 7, ministry has not been easy. In fact, it's increasingly difficult. He's got these religious leaders nipping at his heels. The conversations have been difficult. These religious preachers, the popular preachers of his day, are increasingly hostile to his ministry. And for most of this chapter, the discussion has been just what is clean and unclean. What is good for a Jew? What isn't good for a Jew? And accusations have been leveled against Jesus and his disciples. The first part of Mark chapter 7 is, hey, your disciples are unclean. They don't wash their hands before they eat. These disciples and Jesus are not doing the things the way that their religious community had been used to. Their pop religianity is not comfortable with Jesus and the disciples. They're rocking the boat. They are challenging the status quo. And so there are efforts to make Jesus look like he's foolish. There have been attempts already to discredit Jesus and his disciples. And so, having finished a very difficult conversation, he leaves town. And he's leaving town, setting Israel on a new course. Because the interesting thing is, before this chapter is over, it becomes quite apparent that one of the reasons why he is challenging the status quo is Jesus represents a new day. He is a new deal. He is setting Israel on a new course with a new agenda. And so here we find him leaving town. And that's where our passage picks up in chapter 7. We read it already. I'm going to read it again. From there, Jesus rose. He went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. He entered a house and didn't want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. So Jesus is looking to get away from the crowds. He's looking to have some respite from these difficult conversations. And he is traveling north of Israel in what we know now today to be Lebanon, north of Israel. And this region of that area of the world has always been hostile to Israel. And Jesus just so happens to be traveling through the childhood stomping grounds of a lady named Jezebel. She is the Old Testament's wicked witch of the West. Only she's north. She was always out to do harm to Israel. And interesting, dogs are in her story as well in a very sordid way. And I'll let you read that in the Old Testament. But Jesus is going through her old stomping grounds, where she is well known. And this, again, is an area that's known for its antagonism of Israel. And Mark even makes almost like a side comment here in the text that even as Jesus attempts to have some privacy and go into this house, he says he will not be hidden. Jesus will not be hidden. He is not successful. He goes into a house, and even there he is tracked down. And he's tracked down by a woman whose daughter is being tormented by a demon. And that's where this story takes a nosedive. You know, everything about this story is wrong. Everything about this story is wrong. Jesus is traveling in the land of Jezebel. He's not even in Israel. He's traveling through the land of the enemy. And Jesus, a rabbi, is approached by a woman, something you did not do in that day. He's not only approached by a woman, which is again taboo, he is approached by a Gentile woman. And Gentiles, of course, were unclean by any standard. But this isn't just a Gentile woman. This is a Syrophoenician. Again, bitter enemies of Israel. This whole thing is wrong. And it continues. Not only is this a Gentile woman, not only is this a Syrophoenician, she's got a little daughter who is sick. And she's just not sick. She has a demon. Again, someone who is unclean. So she has a child. And even into that, this is all wrong because, again, in that society, in that day, you see it in the Gospels time and again, people are wanting to bring kids and the kids are being shooed aside because children were to be seen and not heard in that culture. The whole story is wrong. This daughter is infirm not simply with a physical ailment. She's possessed by spiritual forces that have set themselves against Jesus. And so what we have here then is a lady who is an outcast among outcasts. And note the posture that's part of this story. We find her falling at Jesus' feet and begging. Even that is wrong. Not only do women not approach, you don't fall down and you prostrate yourself at someone's feet. So everything about the story is wrong. Wrong approach, wrong people, wrong sickness. And Jesus has just had this discussion about clean and unclean and what is at his feet. At his feet is the very embodiment of what it means to be unclean. He's had discussion about unclean lips, unclean hearts, and now an unclean Gentile, a pagan woman in the land of the very wicked Jezebel with a daughter who has a demon. And the interesting thing about this then, in this passage, all these things that are wrong, it doesn't even end there. Jesus seems to run with this very negative narrative in spite of the woman's desperation at his feet. And so here's Jesus' response. Jesus says to her, again, she's at his feet, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." At first blush, that sounds what it sounds like, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see where Jesus is going with this. It sounds a bit harsh. And it seems to reinforce this idea of Jews versus the Gentiles, and what Gentiles are if you're a Jew. He speaks of the woman and her people as dogs. Now, before you leave here and say, "Hey, that guy who stood there in Pastor Steve's place, you should have heard him talk about Jesus." No. It sounds antagonistic, but on further reading of this text, it's not. We're going to see that in Jesus' second response, so just hang on here. It's not antagonistic. In fact, I think he says this to this woman with kind of a half smile. It's a test for her to elicit a response. And not only is he probably saying with a half smile, remember the habit of his enemies, the habit of these popular preachers of his day were to follow Jesus everywhere he went, probably into this home, and they're probably hearing this conversation. What is Jesus going to do with this unclean Gentile? And so he's setting them up. And he's eliciting a response from this Gentile lady. They're looking to make him look bad. But Jesus and this lady are going to turn the tables. Now, Jesus here, when he says it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, he obviously is using a metaphor about dogs to speak of a greater reality. And Jesus is reminding this unclean Gentile woman at his feet, begging for mercy and grace on behalf of her daughter, that the gospel and all of its benefits were first for the Jew. And we understand that as we read our Old Testaments and come into the New Testament. That salvation has come to the Jews. And it comes bringing all those benefits that had been promised in the Old Testament. It brings sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and freedom to those who are bound in Satan's darkness. And that gospel that long ago had been promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David, it's here in the person of Jesus. And Jesus has come to free, according to Matthew, he's come to free his people from their sins. But that's not the entirety of the gospel story, is it? So this conversation between Jesus and this Gentile woman has just begun. This pagan woman is at the end of her rope. Salvation may be of the Jews, but she's going to latch on to something that she also knows to be true from the Old Testament and from Jesus' ministry already. And that the salvation is also for the Gentiles. So there she is begging for the gospel. And listen to what she says. This lady answered Jesus, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So it's an amazing answer. She affirms what he says. This is a confession. That's a shocker. She's not going to argue with Jesus. My first response would be, "How dare you?" But she doesn't. She affirms it. She places herself there. She doesn't respond in anger. This is a desperate woman, again, at the end of her rope. And so she's going to run with what Jesus is saying. She's going to run with this narrative. She's going to run with the metaphor. And in the whole thing, then, she cops to being a dog. And there it is. And again, this isn't an Americana dog. It's a Gentile dog. The dog that is a scavenger. The dog that is unclean. The dog that is less than human. And she is laying there at his feet saying, yes, Jesus, that's me. This is me. This is us. The gospel is for us too. So when she says, yet even the dogs under the table are looking for the crumbs from the children, she's saying, yes, Jesus, you're right. But the gospel is for dogs. The gospel and its healing power are for those who are not clean. The gospel is for all. So when confronted with who she has nothing but a confession on her lips. Yes, Jesus, we are dogs, and we just want the crumbs. Life-giving, life-sustaining crumbs. The crumbs of life that have come down from heaven. She only wants to hear, all she wants to hear is take, eat. These crumbs are my body broken for you. That's all she wants. Then amazingly, the one who is the bread of life responds to her in grace, noting the confession from her lips. And Jesus says to her, for this statement, for this confession, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home, and she found the child lying in bed, and the demon was gone. For this statement, this confession of being dogs in need of crumbs, for this confession of a need for the gospel in spite of uncleanness and unworthiness, this confession of a need for the gospel and all of its healing benefits. And Jesus says, it's all yours. It's all yours. You want crumbs? I give you myself, the manna from heaven who gives life to Jews and Gentiles without discrimination. You want crumbs? You have me. Your daughter is healed. Go your way. That, my friends, is the gospel gone to the dogs. Dogs looking for crumbs who get life and life more abundantly. You know, this woman knew something. She knew something that the popular religious preachers of her day did not know. You know, they had the bread. They had the table. They had all the promises of God that had been given to his people. And they had all the benefits that came with being God's chosen people. And so God sends salvation in the form of the person Jesus Christ. God himself descends. And they didn't want it. The bread that had been given to the children, they didn't want. They didn't want Jesus. They didn't want what he was offering. You know, they wanted Jesus plus all the other stuff. They wanted Jesus and all of their book money. They wanted Jesus and all of their conference platforms. They wanted Jesus and all of their own standards for holy living. Jesus plus something else. And here at the foot of Jesus, begging for her daughter, is a woman who wanted Jesus and the gospel and nothing else. Nothing else. She didn't even want a seat at their table. She's under the table. She's at Jesus' feet begging, and she wants nothing more than the crumbs of life that have come down from heaven for her. And she knew that that crumbs from the bread of life was all that she needed, and all that her daughter needed to be made whole. And she knew that crumbs from the bread of life, grace, was all that was needed for Jesus to exercise his rule and reign over the demon that possessed her daughter. She just wanted Jesus. So here in this story, in this woman at Jesus' feet, we find this great gospel truth that the gospel is not for the successful. The gospel is not for all those that have it together, that have the great life. The gospel is not for those who are working their way up the holiness ladder. The gospel is not for those even trying to be better Christians. The gospel is for dogs. The gospel is for those of us who are unclean. The gospel is for those of us who know that we need the crumbs of forgiveness that Jesus provides. The gospel is for those who come here looking to be fed from Jesus in his word and in his table. Because we know we're unclean. Because we know we need forgiveness. And we're satisfied with that. We're satisfied with just crumbs. All we need is Jesus, and everything else is right with the world. So the gospel is those who come to Jesus and come to this table in all of our brokenness, all of our uncleanness, looking for crumbs from the bread of life. This is the gospel gone to the dogs. Jesus, I thank you for all that you have shown us in this passage. May we come and see ourselves at your feet in need of what you provide. May we see ourselves as dogs, those who are unclean, in need of your forgiveness. We thank you for what you have done for us on the cross and resurrection on our behalf. For us dogs. In your name I pray. Amen.